Overthinkers of Reddit. What unlikely scenario actually came true that you were completely prepared for because you are an overthinker? Story 1. When my wife and I were getting married and looking for a place for the ceremony, we found this beautiful but quite remote garden. We were signing the contract for the event, and I kept thinking that it was quite remote, so I asked, "How much time does it take for the ambulance to get here?" I became the laughingstock of both families. My then future mother in law, who was present at the meeting, literally fell from the chair laughing. The wedding organizer remembered it for weeks, telling everyone we met. My dad ended every sentence with, "But maybe you need an ambulance for that." My wife was making siren noises when I was saying something we disagreed on, and at every family dinner, all the aunts and uncles were checking if the ambulance was present. You name it, the entire package. Still, I couldn't get rid of this weird feeling. It would have taken over an hour for the ambulance to get to the garden. After a few weeks, I ended up paying for a private ambulance to be present at the wedding. Fast forward to the ceremony, as my wife literally walks down the aisle, at the back of the garden, I see two paramedics running with a stretcher and my dad squeezing my hand, whispering, "That's none of your goddamn business, let them take care of it." What happened was that one of our older guests got a heart attack and almost died at the ceremony, was saved by the private ambulance. Ever since then, when my wife tells me that I'm overthinking, I just do the siren noise. Story 2. The panic attack that the overthinking caused. I feel like a fraud. I haven't had a panic attack in 3 years? Although I've had a handful of baby panic attacks since then. At one point, 1 month, I must have had 30 plus panic attacks. I was constantly in a panic attack/depression cycle, and my brain worked so poorly that it felt like I lost a lot of my intelligence and almost all of my personality. But with therapy, lots of journaling, exercise, and especially learning to gauge how likely something is to happen when I experience fear and not listening to unwarranted catastrophic thinking, I've recovered a lot and my anxiety levels are much more manageable. Story 3. So maybe not quite this, but my little sister. Through a long series of events, my parents, who were not foster parents and not looking to adopt, ended up taking care of an infant, not related to us at all, whose mother had just died. It was only supposed to be for a few weeks until she could be moved to a more permanent placement. As soon as I found out that my parents had agreed to help watch her temporarily, I knew where this was going, and I had all the initial adoption application paperwork printed out before she ever got to our house. Needless to say, my parents were pretty surprised the day they said they were thinking of adopting her, and I handed them a folder of forms and my handwritten notes on how the process worked. For the record, she has legally been my little sister for 7 years now. Story 4. I'm an amateur clarinetist. I've played in the local orchestra and the like. My son was in the high school band, also played the clarinet. Before a football game at the warm-up area, he called me as I was about to head to the game, saying that someone in his section had a problem with their instrument, so did I have a loaner? Now, the thing about being a clarinet player is that everyone you know calls you every time they see a cheap plastic clarinet for sale at a garage sale or the like. So, over the years, especially when my son was in junior and senior high, when I saw one of these for $50 or $100, I grabbed it. Didn't happen every day, but at the peak of my collection, I had a couple of beater plastic clarinets in addition to the pretty good wooden one my son played. And Lord knows I wouldn't trust anyone with my good clarinets in B, B, and A as I used in the orchestra. So I grabbed both of these plastic jobs, which actually played okay, and brought them in. I pulled the one I thought was the better of the two out of the car and gave it to my son's friend. Meanwhile, he says, "Hey, another person ran into a problem," and I got the second clarinet out of the car. "How many clarinets do you have?" was my son's question. It was a proud moment. Story 5. This was at 9 years old. We had driven home and seen the beginning wisps of smoke from the California cedar fire in 2003. Naturally, I assumed the worst, packed up all my clothes, and spent about an hour making a travel cage for my guinea pigs. I tied their water bottle to the side so they could drink and packed up their food and their favorite furniture just in case. I then spent the next few hours monitoring the fire on the news and out in the distance from our window, periodically asking my parents if we needed to evacuate. At some point in the night, the fire sped up like crazy and was literally on the hillside across the street. I went into my parents' room and said, "The fire's across the street. Are you sure we shouldn't evacuate?" At this point, we all went crazy, grabbing important documents and supplies. As we were about to lock the doors and drive, I realized I forgot my guinea pigs. My parents told me it was too late and I didn't have time to grab them, but when I cried and explained I had packed them up, I was able to grab them and go. The house ended up okay thanks to a neighbor putting out embers before they took, but if we were gone long enough, my pigs wouldn't have made it. I helped save my family and pets from a fire because I was an anxious child. Story 6. When I was 11, I always kept approximately 12 to 15 of some combination of pens, pencils, and markers in my pant pocket. I just like having options and never knew what I was going to need to write on. Sometimes I got some side eye from other kids, though. At a weekend camp with a bunch of kids, I'm participating in a sort of scavenger hunt race thing. At one point, our teams hit this task where everyone has to draw or write something. I don't really remember. But there are only 2 pens, about 10 people per team, and another team just showed up. With 1 pen assigned to each team, it's going slow until you get a pen. You get a pen, everybody gets a pen. Our team screams through the task because we could all write simultaneously while the other teams left plodding along with their 1 pen. We eventually won. Who's weird now? Story 7. I've never told anyone this, but when I was in middle school and going through puberty, I used to be terrified of getting a random boner in my fly being down accidentally. I would be up in front of the class and then randomly get an erection and it would just pop out of my fly in front of the whole class. LOL. It's making me laugh now just thinking about this. Do you know that episode of South Park where Jimmy keeps getting random stiffies? That was basically my life. Usually I would just tuck it in my waistband and wait for the storm to settle, but I still had the huge fear of it popping out of my flight because I forgot to zip it up. So what did I do? I started wearing my boxers backwards so that even if I forgot to zip up my fly, my schlong would not be exposed. It was a pain to use the urinals, but honestly, I got used to it pretty quickly. Flash forward a couple of months and I was at the movies with a big gathering of people. It was basically a big group of girls and my group of guy friends. Each guy and girl paired up and made sure to sit next to each other. I was paired with a girl I had a huge crush on. We shared popcorn and soda and it was a huge moment for me. Briefly into the movie, I got one of those damn random boners and I quickly but discreetly stood up and did the old waistband tuck. When I sat back down, I could feel it pop out through my zipper. Thankfully, my backward boxers kept it from saying hello to my date, but I still panicked and had to cover up in a hurry. She noticed, but I think we can all agree that a 6th grade boy's erect penis hiding under a layer of underwear is better than just sprouting out bare in the middle of a crowded movie theater. Also, she never said anything to her friends about it. Shout out to Stephanie for not mocking me with her friends. Story 8. My boyfriend, who has 0 history of seizures, narrowly escaped dying from one because my overthinking led me to break into his house when he didn't answer the phone. My overthinking had begun a few nights prior. He mentioned that he bit his tongue in his sleep and woke up with a bloody pillow and sore mouth, but he had no memory of it happening. That for some reason led my overthinking brain to question, wow, did he have a seizure and not realize it? Now he has 0 history of seizures and we had been together multiple years, didn't live together but spent nights together. And I had never seen a hint of a seizure, but for some reason this one stuck in my mind. Fast forward 2 days, we usually don't hang out in the morning because he likes to sleep in late, but on this day we had an appointment to go see a specific dog at the shelter I was thinking of adopting. He wouldn't answer the phone that morning. I called multiple times before I went to his place, but he never picked up. I started getting a bad feeling, but quelled the he's having a seizure thought because that was clearly so unlikely, meanwhile making an action plan for that very scenario. So I get to his house and he doesn't answer, and in a completely not me crazy girlfriend move, I climbed over his fence and luckily his door was unlocked. I found him unconscious and unresponsive, lying on his back with the sticky remnants of foam all around his mouth. I jumped into action, I rolled him on his side to help curb aspiration, put a pillow under his shoulder to keep him in that position, and called the ambulance. Had I not hopped the fence to get in, had I not driven over when he didn't pick up the phone, had we not have made plans to meet up hours earlier than we usually did, he might have been dead by lunch. His kidneys were already shutting down by the time he reached the ER. If he had never mentioned biting his tongue in his sleep, I don't think I would have been overthinking at all. No crazy worries about seizures would have pushed me to go over and find him. Turns out to be a weird brain disease that's bizarrely endemic to New Mexico, kind of cerebral cavernous malformation something. Several days later, after we got home from the hospital, I got a call from a friend who said the dog, against all odds, was still at the shelter, as in the very dog we were supposed to be seeing that day. I had given up hope on getting her and pushed it out of my priorities while my boyfriend was hospitalized, but they had forgotten to take down my 24-hour hold sign on her cage at the shelter, so no one inquired about her. She's now our miracle dog and is the sweetest animal I've ever owned. My boyfriend wouldn't be alive today if we hadn't made an appointment to meet her. Story 9. I found a nickel-sized lump on my 15-month-old daughter's temple, freaked out, obsessed over it, researched it exhaustively, and concluded it was a dermoid cyst that had worn through the skull. I was told by a pediatrician that it was a bone bruise that would fix itself over 3 to 6 months. No imaging was needed, and I shouldn't make an appointment at the children's hospital because it would resolve on its own. I got an x ray done anyway, and the radiologist confirmed every one of my suspicions. But the pediatrician still said to wait and see because that's what you do with dermoid cysts, and it was definitely not through the skull, despite what the radiologist said. I made an appointment at the hospital anyway, and the surgeon swore up and down that although it was a dermoid cyst, as I had suspected, it would not be through the skull since in all his years of practice, it never had been. Well, guess what? It was through the skull, and it was pressing on the membrane between the skull and the brain, a hair's breadth from breaking the membrane or pressing on the brain itself. After a couple more weeks of waiting, my daughter could have had seizures, a brain infection, and lasting damage. So I overthought it, and now she's a happy, healthy 3-year-old. Story 10. Honestly, this whole pandemic, I've struggled with severe germophobia my whole life, and as a little kid, I found out what a pandemic was and was really scared of the idea of one happening at some point in my lifetime. The more I read up on pandemics and their history as I grew up and lived with that fear, the more likely I came to feel it was. When COVID was just a thing in Wuhan, I had heard it could be transmissible for weeks before it showed any signs and symptoms, and in the modern day of fast, worldwide travel constantly occurring on a mass scale, I right away felt like there's no way this thing won't become as uncontained as possible in no time. I right away started to say that it was going to spread worldwide, be a serious issue, and that people here in the States wouldn't handle it well or act reasonably, and would panic and buy everything off the shelves at first and then immediately not take it seriously at all and call you weak if you do take it seriously. Everyone I know laughed at me, rolled their eyes, and told me I'm a crazy germaphobe. And then literally every single last detail of every single thing that's happened here in the US, from how bad it got exactly to the early panic buying days to the politicizing of the virus, and the way Trump used that to his advantage, to how long it's been around and how things might start wrapping up and getting back to normal a bit if we can vaccinate, all happened exactly the way I called it, play by play, like a year and some months ago. So I don't know if I'd call everything that's happened quote unquote unlikely, really, but at the mental level and even partially the level of resources / taking precautions, the experts tell us to take well before the experts began to tell us to take them. I already had masks, etc., and was social distancing before that was even a thing here. I've kind of been gearing up for this my whole life in some ways. Story 11. A year and a half ago, my wife was doing the Susan G. Komen 3-day walk, and she was staying in a house that was rented. She had just finished day 2, and her body was essentially done at that point. In the middle of the night, she woke up with severe sweating and dizziness. She started vomiting, and by the next morning, didn't feel much better. So I get the call, "Can you come to take me to urgent care?" Oh shit, this is my wife we're talking about. The toughest lady that I've ever known, never asks for help with anything. Strong as an ox and about as stubborn as one too. So when she asks me to take her to the doctor or the hospital, I'm out the door in seconds. I drove down to the house to get her. Before we leave, I remember she told me she vomited last night. Well, I'd been there the night before to bring our daughter to see her before she fell ill, and I'd played in the sand at the beach with her with some of the beach toys the house had on hand. So I just grab a bucket in case she needs to throw up in it. We made it to urgent care without incident, but I brought that damn bucket in either way because I'll be damned if something goes down. Sure enough, she gets the urge to throw up while we're there, and wouldn't you know it, the bathrooms were both occupied. Bucket to the rescue. I felt like a goddamn hero. Story 12. I was in an abusive marriage. I had started planning a way to leave, but had an emergency go-right-now bag in case it got really bad. It had spare clothes, a card to a bank account my ex-husband didn't have access to and didn't know I had, some cash, several weeks of meds, a brief medical history with doctor's info in case I was hurt and had to go to a hospital, etc. I hid it in the spare tire wheel space of my car. The top layer was just clothing that I had in some shopping bags. It looked like I had bought clothes without him knowing. Anyway, he found it one day. Luckily, he just took the shopping bag out and got really pissed off and left everything else. Anyway, I never got to use it for myself because he got arrested, thank God. But afterward, I noticed a friend had the look of being abused. It was pretty clear what was happening. After gently approaching her, she acknowledged that she was being abused but didn't feel like she could leave. So I helped her hook up with a domestic violence victim advocate, but I also had her change my name in her phone to a pizza shop. I also made her a go right now bag for her too and put it in my car. 30 days later, I got a call for a large cheese pizza with extra sauce. I called 911, drove to her house, beat the cops there, and heard her screaming. I knocked the window out and climbed in, saw her husband with a knife. I just ran and grabbed her, unlocked the door, and got her into the car. Had the phone on me the whole time. I also had a first aid kit with a ton of wound gauze, so I just pressed that in and waited as a husband tried to take out our window. Finally, I told the 911 operator that I was going to drive away. The cop showed up, arrested the husband, took my friend to the hospital. Saved her life, and since her home was a crime scene, she needed a go right now bag too. I keep a generic one in my car at all times. I've used more than one for more than a few women and one for a man. Once you've been through it, you can see it. I never want to be unprepared, just in case. Story 13. Backpacking. I'm always the over-prepared one, to the point I got a bit of rubbing from my friends. I always have a rather fleshed out first aid kit and a couple really useful things to fix gear when you're out in the sticks. In particular, super glue, 50 inches of parachute cord, and a small roll of duct tape. And would you know it, we hiked down the wilderness trail from the Lincoln Trailhead. It's a straight as an arrow old railway bed. At the end is a nice campsite. We show up, sort our stuff out, and a couple shows up at our tent asking if we've got anything to fix a hiking boot. The sole had partially peeled off from the heel of the boot. They were hiking out the next morning, so it didn't have to be perfect. It just had to last the 7 miles to the trailhead on flat ground. I glued the sole back on the boot and held the whole thing in place with a bit of duct tape so it would set. Worked like a charm. The whole time I was repairing, everybody was commenting on how handy it was that I had brought super glue with me. And I kept thinking to myself, why would you go deep into the woods without some simple supplies to fix your gear?